Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine the sheer, incredible feat of learning to read and write, not just in one language, but in two. How do you build that complex skill set in a student's first language, say Spanish, while simultaneously, growing it in their second language, like English? It's a fascinating challenge with massive potential.
It really is. And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We're going through your sources here to pull out the core ideas, the foundational concepts, the teaching approaches, and the ways teachers figure out where students actually are on that path to literacy in both languages.
Right, so we're going to look at how literacy actually develops, how educators assess progress, the frameworks they use, and crucially, the brilliant ways that skills learned in one language can actually boost learning in the other.
Yeah, our mission really is to cut through all the details and give you the most important insights from this material. Just trying to paint a clear picture of what it takes to guide these emergent bilingual students toward becoming truly biliterate.
Consider us your guides through this intel. I'm the friend who loves learning, and you're the expert connecting the dots for us. Ready?
Let's do it. Absolutely. So the absolute first thing the material makes crystal clear is just how vital it is to build a strong foundation of literacy in a student's primary language, their L1. This isn't just like a nice to have, it's foundational.
Okay, foundational, but why? Why is starting strong in L1 so critical?
Well, because the research consistently shows that students who get really strong literacy skills in their L1, they tend to have much greater success with academic English later on. It's not about replacing the first language at all. It's about building this robust base that supports everything that comes after. Think of it like building a house, right? A strong foundation in L1 makes the whole structure of biliteracy much more stable, much higher potential.
Okay, that makes sense. And the journey itself, becoming a reader and writer, it follows similar patterns, doesn't it? Whether it's Spanish or English, kids kind of move through predictable stages.
That's right, yeah. While every child is different, of course, literacy development generally progresses through these three broad stages, which are laid out really nicely in the material.
Okay, so tell us about the first one, the emergent stage.
Right, so emergent. This is where the very earliest explorations happen. Kids might be pretend reading, flipping pages, looking at pictures, or pretend writing with scribbles, maybe some symbols. They're starting to understand that print means something, but they haven't quite cracked the code yet of matching specific speech sounds to the letters on the page.
Got it. Exploring. Okay, then comes the beginning stage. What happens there?
Okay, beginning stage. Here's where things start clicking, Students are learning the alphabet, they're starting to sound out words, but it's often pretty slow going. They need lots of support. And when they write, they're often trying to capture the sounds they hear phonetically, but the spelling might be incomplete. Just getting the main sounds down.
Right, like inventive spelling. And the third stage, instructional stage.
Yeah, instructional. This is where independence really starts to take off. Students are reading more smoothly, often silently, gaining automaticity with words. That means they're not struggling quite so much to decode every single word anymore, which frees up their brain power, right?
Yeah.
To focus on what the text actually means. Comprehension becomes the focus. They also start learning more about conventional spelling and grammar.
Okay. Now, even though those stages sound pretty universal, the source material points out a really crucial difference between Spanish and English when it comes to actually decoding the words. This is where it gets really interesting, the orthography thing.
Yes, this is key. English is what we call opaque. Think about words like read, R-E-A-D. It can be read or read, or lead or led. Same letters, different sounds, there are tons of exceptions. Spanish, on the other hand, is much more transparent. Once you learn the basic sounds of the letters and common combinations, you can pretty much decode almost any word. The sound-symbol relationships are very, very predictable.
Huh. And that predictability in Spanish, does learning to break the code there help when they start learning English?
Absolutely. That's a really powerful form of transfer. The process of learning how to decode, that mental skill, that's what transfers. However, and the source is very clear on this, you can't just take English reading methods and apply them wholesale to Spanish instruction. It won't work perfectly because of that orthographic difference. And importantly, this transfer isn't automatic. Teachers need specific knowledge to actually help students make those cross-language connections.
So teaching literacy in Spanish isn't just a mirror image of teaching reading in English. You can't just translate the lesson plans.
Not entirely, no. Many effective balanced literacy approaches do work well in Spanish too. Things like modeling reading aloud, shared reading, guided reading groups, writing workshops. That stuff transfers.
Mm-hmm.
But the material really emphasizes something critical. These approaches are only truly effective when Spanish literacy instruction is given equal status and time as English instruction.
Equal status and time. How does a school or a teacher actually do that in practice? What does that look like?
Well, it means making Spanish visible and valued everywhere, having a rich print environment in Spanish posters, labels, student work, stocking libraries equally well with high-quality, authentic Spanish books, not just translations from English, and ensuring the literature collections reflect the diverse heritages of the students in the classroom. Kids need daily, real opportunities to read and write in Spanish, just like they get in English.
Okay. We often hear about the big 5 components of reading for English: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. Does that same framework map directly onto Spanish literacy?
That's a great question. That framework really comes from the National Reading Panel's work, which was heavily focused on English. What's fascinating, and what the source points out, is that research coming out of Mexico, specifically looking at Spanish speakers, shows a slightly different picture for phonemic and phonological awareness. In Spanish, these aren't necessarily seen as skills you have to master before you start reading and writing. The material suggests they're more integral to the reading process itself. They should be taught concurrently, woven into reading and writing instruction right from the start.
Wow, okay, so that's a pretty fundamental difference in approach depending on the language, even at the very beginning. How does that actually change what a teacher does day to day?
Well, it means, for Spanish, the teacher isn't necessarily spending weeks just drilling sounds in isolation before connecting them to letters and words on a page. They're weaving that sound awareness directly into the process of learning to decode and learning to write right from the get-go. It really highlights why teachers need to understand these language-specific nuances, not just general reading theory,
Definitely. So wrapping the section up, understanding these foundational stages, the differences in how languages like Spanish and English work, especially with spelling and sounds, and these unique aspects of L1 Spanish development, that's really step 1 for anyone wanting to support literacy across 2 languages.
Exactly. And once you have that foundation, well, you need ways to know how students are actually doing, how they're progressing.
Which brings us perfectly to section 2. Knowing where they stand, literacy assessments in L1. Why is ongoing assessment so critical here?
Because assessment is basically the teacher's compass, right? It gives them the information they need to make smart decisions about instruction, to know if what they're doing is working, and figure out what each individual student needs next. It's really about guiding instruction, not just giving grades.
Makes sense. The material mentions 2 main types of assessment, formal and informal.
Yep. So formal assessments, those are the ones with established validity and reliability, standardized procedures. Everybody takes it the same way, scored the same way. Think of state tests like STORE, which is available in Spanish and Texas for grades 3 to 5, or those universal screeners they use in the early grades, things like TXKIA, M-Class Texas, TPRI, Tejas LEE. Those are required in Texas for K2, sometimes 7th grade too. The main goal of screeners is to quickly flag students who might be struggling, maybe falling below the 25th percentile, so they can get extra support early on.
Okay, the big standardized ones.
Yeah.
And then there are the ones that teachers use more like day-to-day.
Exactly. Those are the informal assessments, sometimes called authentic or alternative assessments. They're much more flexible, often performance-based, and tailored to the individual kid. These are the constant checks teachers use all the time, observing students during activities. How engaged are they? Using quick writes, just short, fast bursts of writing, or quick tells, having kids quickly explain something to a partner. Using question stems like, today I learned blank, or I'm still confused by blank. Exit tickets at the end of a lesson. Making top 3 lists. Concept maps. Even simple things like color cards. Red means I need help. Green means I got it. Yellow, I'm working on it.
So it's not just about the big tests at the end of the year. It's this whole toolkit of observations and quick checks that give teachers a real-time pulse on how students are doing in their first language.
Precisely. These informal tools provide that rich, detailed picture needed to truly understand individual student needs and adjust teaching, moment to moment.
Got it. Okay, so from knowing where students stand, the material then shifts to the roadmap that guides the teaching itself. Standards and curriculum.
Right. And it briefly mentions the importance of teachers having specific state certification for bilingual education, which makes sense, right? It highlights that this isn't just teaching general reading. It really requires specialized knowledge.
And then there are the specific curriculum standards, like the Spanish language arts and reading texts in Texas you mentioned.
Exactly. The SLAR texts, as they're called. They're structured around these integrated strands: foundational skills, comprehension, response, collaboration, etc. It shows that listening, speaking, reading, writing, thinking they aren't separate subjects. They're all deeply interconnected parts of language arts.
And they line up with the English standards, the English texts.
Yes. There's what's called horizontal alignment across the grade levels, so they cover similar concepts at each grade. But, and this is critical, there are noteworthy differences because Spanish and English have distinct conventions, grammar, spelling patterns, things like that. Apparently, side-by-side comparison documents exist to help teachers see those specific differences. And just as important is vertical alignment, understanding how skills build across grade levels. That's crucial for ensuring a smooth, coherent progression from kindergarten all the way up.
So teachers use these standards, the texts, as their blueprint to make sure students are building that comprehensive set of skills in Spanish language arts, just like they would be in English.
Exactly right. It provides the necessary structure and ensures nothing major gets missed.
Okay, now this next part, Section 4, this is where the potential of bilingualism really seems to shine. Making connections, the transfer of literacy from L1 to L2. The material talks about this interdependent system. What's that about?
Yes, this is the really cool part. Emergent bilingual students aren't learning two separate, isolated boxes of language skills. Their languages connect, they interact, they form this integrated system. This interdependence is what facilitates the transfer of literacy skills from L1 to L2. Their L1 knowledge isn't something to be overcome or ignored. It's the actual foundation upon which L2 literacy is built. It's an asset.
And to navigate this whole system, students need to develop what are called the 3 cueing systems in both languages, meaning structure and visual.
Absolutely. These are basically the mental tools students use constantly to make sense of language, whether listening, speaking, reading, or writing. Meaning semantic. Asking, does this make sense? Using their background knowledge, word meanings, the context of the sentence or story. Structure, syntactic. Asking, does this sound right? Understanding the rules of grammar, word order, how sentences are put together in that language. Visual, graphophonic. Asking, does this look right? Connecting the letters on the page to sounds, recognizing word parts, understanding print concepts like directionality. Developing these really robustly in L1 makes getting the hang of them in L2 much, much more efficient.
Okay, digging deeper into that transfer, the source highlights how phonological awareness, just being aware of the sounds in language, is strongly related across English and Spanish.
It really is.
Yeah.
And students benefit hugely when teachers explicitly help them see those connections. There are many sounds and even blends that transfer pretty easily. Sounds like M, K, T, K, and blends like PL, P, L, B, and those exist in both languages.
But there are also tricky sounds in English for Spanish speakers, right? Sounds or combinations that just don't exist in Spanish.
Oh, absolutely. The source lists several common ones. The different sounds of D in English, like in this versus dog. The J sound as in judge. The V sound, the Z sound. So very she in the E sounds. Consonant blends like istes, P. At the beginning of words are tough because Spanish words don't start that way. They usually have an E sound before, like estudiante. And final sounds. Spanish often drops final consonants, or they're softer, making English words ending in sounds like E, easted, gig. Pretty difficult to hear and produce accurately at first.
What about those stop sounds like B, D, G?
Yes, that's another common one. Students learning English might add a little vowel sound, like a schwa at the end. So big might sound like bigger. The material is clear. Teachers need to explicitly teach these unique English sounds. But it also stresses the importance of accepting approximations initially, especially while kids are focused on making meaning. Perfect pronunciation takes time, but targeted support, maybe for voiced versus unvoiced sounds, is definitely needed.
Right. Going back to that orthography difference, knowing Spanish is predictable, transparent, and English is less so, opaque, how does understanding that help teachers support transfer?
Well, it helps them anticipate where students might stumble when decoding in English. A student who's used to Spanish's reliable sound spelling patterns might get confused by English words like though, through, tough. Understanding this helps the teacher provide really specific phonics instruction focused on those tricky English patterns. They can leverage the decoding skill the student already has from Spanish, but help them apply it to this less predictable English system.
Okay. Now, the source introduces a really powerful, specific strategy for making these connections happen, the bridge. What exactly is the bridge?
The bridge. Yeah, this is a really neat practical strategy. It's basically a planned instructional moment. It often happens after a unit of content, say science or social studies, has been taught and maybe assessed in both languages. It's a specific time where the teacher explicitly brings the two languages together to help students make conscious connections between them.
So it's not just hoping they figure out the links themselves, it's intentional.
Very intentional, yeah. During the bridge, students might transfer key vocabulary or important phrases from one language to the other. They might engage in some age-appropriate comparing and contrasting of the languages that's called metalinguistic analysis, or apply academic language they learned in the unit in the other language. The key thing is, the focus is on language instruction and facilitating transfer, using the content they just learned as the context. It's not about reteaching the science lesson, for example.
And this can look different depending on the goal.
Exactly. The source mentions a few types, like side-by-side comparisons of texts or grammar points, using illustrations or graphs to bridge concepts, or structured activities like así se dice, which means how you say it. Genius. And what's great is that the bridge isn't just for older kids. It can start happening as early as preschool and continue all the way up across all content areas, not just language arts.
Wow. And does the research back this up, this kind of explicit connection making?
Strongly positive, yes. The research suggests that the earlier and the longer teachers purposefully plan for these kinds of cross-language connections, like the bridge, like explicitly teaching cognates, the better those students tend to perform academically down the road. It really capitalizes on their existing linguistic resources. It uses their whole brain.
Speaking of using their whole brain, the source introduces another key concept, translanguaging. What's the core idea there?
Right, translanguaging. It's a perspective, really, that acknowledges that bilingual individuals don't operate with two completely separate language systems locked away in different brain compartments. They have one integrated linguistic repertoire. And they draw on that entire repertoire flexibly and dynamically to make meaning, to communicate, to learn. So translanguaging in the classroom is about validating and allowing students to use their full range of linguistic skills, even if that means mixing languages sometimes, like using a Spanish word in an English sentence, if it's the word that comes to mind, while also guiding them towards standard forms in both languages.
So if a student says something like, I don't know, can I go to the baño? That's not necessarily seen as an error, but as them using their full toolkit.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of translanguaging. They're using the linguistic resources they have to communicate effectively. A translanguaging approach recognizes and validates that, while perhaps also gently modeling or teaching the English word restroom or bathroom in context. It leverages their natural language use as a bridge itself.
Okay. And cognate awareness is another specific strategy mentioned to leverage those connections, like related words.
Yes, and it's such a powerful and efficient one. Cognates are words in two languages that share a similar origin, meaning, and often spelling, like information in English and information in Spanish. This involves explicitly teaching students to recognize these related words. The examples in the source are great patterns. Spanish words ending in "-ad" often correspond to English words ending in "-ethity", like natividad and nativity, or curiosidad and curiosity. Or Spanish "aeon" often matches English "eon". Spanish "idumbre" can relate to English "elitude", like certidumbre and certitude. Teaching students to spot these patterns is a fantastic shortcut to rapidly building English academic vocabulary and comprehension because they can connect it directly back to their Spanish knowledge.
Wow. This whole section really drives home that bilingualism isn't a problem to be fixed, it's a huge asset. By understanding how skills transfer and using these intentional strategies like the bridge, translanguaging, and cognate awareness, teachers can really help students unlock their L2 potential by building on their L1 strength.
It completely flips the script, doesn't it? From thinking about remediation to thinking about leveraging existing strengths. It's powerful.
Which brings us nicely to the final section, the ultimate goal. Section 5, promoting full biliteracy. Now, what exactly does the material mean by biliteracy? It's more than just being able to read in two languages, right?
Oh, much more. Biliteracy, as it's described here, includes reading and writing proficiency in two languages, yes, but it also crucially includes strong oral language skills, what the source calls orvacy, and also metalinguistic awareness, that ability to think and talk about language in both languages. And the goal is always an additive process. You're adding English literacy to a strong L1 base. You're not trying to replace or subtract the L1.
And why pursue this? Why is full biliteracy the aim?
Well, the research consistently points towards its potential for deeper cognitive processing, greater academic achievement overall, and also fostering a richer linguistic and cultural identity for the student. The source explicitly says the teacher's role isn't to try and prevent the languages from confusing each other by keeping them strictly separate. It's actually the opposite. It's to actively support literacy development in both languages simultaneously to, as it says, unleash the potential of biliteracy.
That concept of one linguistic repertoire seems really central here too, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. It reinforces that idea that the most supportive learning environment is one that allows students to draw from their entire linguistic toolkit. Research suggests students actually learn best when they can access and use all their language knowledge flexibly.
So if that's the goal, then assessing biliteracy also needs to look different than just giving two separate monolingual tests.
Exactly. You need assessment approaches that actually understand and capture what a student knows and can do across both languages. Frameworks like Literacy Squared are mentioned, which look at biliterate trajectories, how students are progressing towards full biliteracy over time. Instead of just judging Spanish writing against a monolingual Spanish standard and English writing against a monolingual English standard, totally separately, the approach is often to look at student work in both languages side by side. This lets you see the student's full range of strategies, including how they might be using translanguaging effectively, and identify strengths and areas for growth across their entire linguistic system.
And what about for reading assessment?
Similarly, there's this concept mentioned called biliterate reading zones. The idea is, if a student demonstrates mastery of a specific reading behavior or skill, like, say, decoding words with consonant digraphs, or using context clues to figure out a word, or monitoring their own comprehension if they show they can do that effectively in either language, you mark it as mastered for them. You don't necessarily need to reteach that fundamental reading skill in the second language, even if their score on a standardized L2 reading test might be lower simply because their overall L2 language proficiency is still developing, not because they lack the reading skill itself. It gives a more accurate picture of their actual reading ability across both languages.
That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned oral secrecy earlier. How key is that oral language piece to achieving biliteracy?
Fundamentally key. Oracy, which is really academic oral language, the ability to listen effectively and speak articulately about complex ideas, is described in the material as being just as crucial as literacy and numeracy. It's presented as a foundational component for developing strong reading and writing skills in both languages. Without strong oral language development, achieving deep literacy is much, much harder.
Are there specific teaching strategies mentioned that are particularly good for building these biliteracy skills day to day?
Yes, one really interesting one highlighted is the dictado. This is described as a Vygotskian-based strategy, meaning it draws on the idea that learning is social. It involves using a short sentence or maybe a short paragraph, something the students already know and understand the meaning of, maybe from a content lesson, and working with that same text over the course of a week.
How does that work exactly? A dictation?
Yeah, it starts with the teacher dictating the text, and the students write it down. But then over the week, they use that same short text as a basis for explicit instruction, focusing on different things each day, maybe spelling patterns one day, grammar or punctuation the next, fluency practice, analyzing sentence structure. Crucially, the source says explicit instruction during dictado includes cross-linguistic transfer. So the teacher would purposefully point out similarities or differences between Spanish and English spelling patterns or grammar points that relate to the text. It helps students develop that metalinguistic awareness and self-correction skills in both languages.
And it scales up, like longer texts for older kids.
Exactly. The source gives examples. Kindergarten might just work with keywords or one very short sentence. First grade, maybe one full sentence. Second grade, perhaps 2 sentences. And third grade and up could handle 3 sentences or a short paragraph. The point is that focused, integrated work on a manageable chunk of text.
And finally, just bringing it all together, the material circles back to the importance of authentic children's literature in both L1 and L2.
Absolutely vital. Can't stress that enough. Using high-quality, authentic books in both languages makes language learning enjoyable and engaging. It provides rich models of how the language is actually used, and importantly, it reflects and affirms students' cultural heritages, which is incredibly motivating and supports their entire literacy journey.
So, promoting full biliteracy. It's clearly a complex effort. It involves these specific instructional approaches that really leverage a student's full linguistic ability, ongoing assessment that accounts for their bilingualism, and making sure they have access to great books and resources in both languages.
It really is about seeing bilingualism as the superpower it is, and then creating the right conditions in the classroom for that superpower to flourish.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started right at the beginning with the absolute foundation of L1 literacy development, the stages kids go through. Then we explored how teachers assess progress using both formal and informal tools. We looked at the standards, like the text that guide instruction.
And then we really got into the exciting part, the magic of transfer between languages.
Hmm.
We talked about that interdependence, the queuing systems, and specific strategies like the bridge, the concept of translanguaging, and leveraging cognate awareness.
Right. And we wrapped up by discussing the multifaceted approach needed to reach the goal of full biliteracy, highlighting practical strategies like the dictado, stressing the importance of all literacy, and emphasizing how assessment itself needs to evolve to really see and value a student's entire linguistic repertoire.
Yeah. I think the clearest takeaway from all this material is that effective bilingual literacy instruction isn't just, a slightly modified version of monolingual teaching. And it's definitely not just about teaching English louder or slower. It's a really sophisticated process. It's about building intentionally on the strong foundation of a student's first language, making those explicit connections between the languages, and using tailored strategies and assessments that truly honor and utilize their entire linguistic toolbox to build proficiency in two languages. It's fundamentally additive, celebrating and building upon everything the student brings with them.
Absolutely. And thinking about that core idea we kept coming back to, that idea of one linguistic repertoire, if we really truly start to see a bilingual person's languages not as two separate things in competition, but as a single integrated system of knowledge and communication skills, how might that fundamentally change the way we approach learning and communication, not just in our schools, but everywhere, in our communities, our workplaces, how we interact with each other?
That is a powerful thought to end on.
This has been a deep dive into your source material on bilingual literacy.